Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Siebert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
Well, welcome to Relationships Inside Out, where today we have a very special guest, Dr. Randi Smith, licensed psychologist and professor at Metro State University in Denver. Here today to talk about infertility. Welcome.
Welcome, Randi.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about, you and your background and what you do and where your specialty is.
Yeah, I'm a psychologist in private practice, and I treat individuals and couples, adults. And infertility is one area of specialization there. And I'm also a professor at MSU Denver, Metropolitan State University of Denver, where I teach human sexuality, among other things. I teach in the clinical area, so I'm helping students who want to become counselors or therapists, clinicians later on. And then also this psychology of sexuality. Those two things kind of interface with the topic that we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit about how you've gotten onto the topic of infertility and how that, I guess, really worked within your clinical space.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I had my own challenges. My husband and I had our own challenges with infertility in our relationship. And it was an incredibly painful time for me. And I've since done a lot of research, literature review kind of research, not original research on infertility. And I've worked with lots and lots of individuals and couples who are going through their own fertility journeys. So it's become a passion for me. And sadly, it's a problem that is increasing in around the world. So it's not uncommon that people have fertility challenges.
And we're increasing how much we talk about it too. So as the rates are going up, we're also starting to talk about it more. So this kind of work is so important.
Yeah. And I guess for our listeners, can you maybe describe a little bit about infertility? I know there's some different aspects to it in different ways it might show up.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the classic definition of infertility is really built on heterosexual couples. And it's when a couple has been trying to conceive, so they've not been using any kind of birth control, and they've been trying to conceive, actively having sex for a year without any conception. And that's considered the time at which, that couple might want to seek the help of a fertility specialist. But I think lost in that definition, and we can talk about, and probably will talk about, infertility among heterosexual couples, and that is the population with whom I have the most expertise, the most experience. But it's also true that fertility challenges affect same-sex couples, and not necessarily under that same definition of infertility, because maybe they're not able to actively try to conceive the same way that heterosexual couples are, but they still have to face the challenges of working with fertility specialists, enlisting help often of reproductive technologies, and then also single people, and typically single women, who are saying, I have not been lucky in love, or I haven't found the right person, or maybe I'm not even interested in finding the right person, but I am very much interested in becoming a parent. And those people also are seeking the help of fertility specialists in order to try to conceive and start a family.
Wow. Yeah, we often don't think about the same-sex couples or different aspects of how this could affect other people, because not everyone is conceiving in the same way as you discussed.
And it's also
right.
too, not just with conception, but when especially that first several weeks, the ability to remain pregnant too. So we're looking at things like miscarriages and stuff too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a huge source of pain for people, and especially someone, an individual or couple that have been trying for a long time to conceive. And then there's this great joy, and then miscarriages are common and tragic.
Reportedly, I think it's 1 in 4, but that's only what's reported. So the rate might actually be higher than what we know.
For miscarriages.
And about infertility, it's about 1 in 5 couples, and that we're looking at the broad range of young couples to, couples in their 40s who are trying to conceive. And we see about 20% of couples will will sort of qualify under that definition of infertility that I provided already. Now, of course, the numbers are lower, the percentage is lower among younger couples, and it increases as the couple, and particularly as the woman gets older.
It's still so painful.
Yeah. And I guess if you feel comfortable speaking to this, what are the options, I guess, people have when they're faced with this?
Yeah, lots of options, and all really have developed within the last 30, 35, 40 years. But, and I'm sure there were fertility challenges as far back as humankind goes. And now we have the good fortune, we have the bad fortune to have increasing rates of infertility, but we have the good fortune to have lots of interventions that can help couples and individuals. Starting with, just the technologies to, for instance, monitor ovulation. This is relatively new. I mean, people could do these like temperature checks for decades and maybe centuries. Even people have been able to monitor temperature. And I'm talking about female people, particularly looking at ovulation cycles. But now we have ways to measure that in much more sophisticated, accurate means. So those kinds of things are probably the first stage, people trying to get a sense of like, what's the menstrual cycle like? What about ovulation? What's, are the regular biological processes in place? And then once there's some clarification about that, there are medications that people might take. And again, typically I'm talking about the people who are in the female bodies taking medications to increase the follicle production, which means like the eggs that are going to be released each month. Typically it's, one egg gets released from one ovary a month, and then the next month it would go to the other ovary. But there are ways to sort of enhance that. There are biological interventions, medications that do that, medications that also stimulate ovulation, so that will, stimulate the ovary to release one or more eggs. And these medications are often very expensive, and many of them require injection. So that, even at these fairly early stages of embarking on a fertility quest, it might mean spending thousands of dollars on medication. It might mean injecting oneself, like learning how to stick oneself with a needle and inject it into your thigh or your abdomen in order to get these like powerful hormones to do the trick there. And then even more advanced than that, we've got the two basic technologies that are most often used are called IUI, which stands for intrauterine insemination. Sometimes it's just called artificial insemination, where a male partner's semen is collected and it evaluated typically and injected directly into the via needle into the uterus of the female partner. And then more advanced than that is IVF, or in vitro fertilization, where the eggs are retrieved through a surgical procedure. Eggs are retrieved from the female partner and combined in a laboratory with sperm from the male partner. And then the embryo is grown there for several days in the laboratory before being implanted in the female partner's uterus.
And with all of these, there are so many side effects that can occur for the partner receiving the treatment. Do you mind sharing about some of those?
Yeah, and I mean, we can talk just about the sort of biological side effects, but then I hope we can talk about the whole like sort of emotional roller coaster that occurs for people. But in terms of the biological side effects, yes, like the person who is taking these drugs, they're pretty powerful, and so they can result in significant hormonal changes to create mood differences, the way that like a bad PMS experience might, or even worse. And then to create a sense of bloating, sometimes tender enlarged breasts. So a range of symptoms that can be, kind of unpleasant and even beyond unpleasant for the person who's taking the drugs.
Do you mind sharing a little bit about infertility for the male? Because I think as a culture, we often assume that infertility is a result of the female body, but often it can be because of the male body too.
That's right. Yeah, it's a little simpler, but not necessarily more easily handled when it's identified as the male partner challenge. But the male partner is providing sperm. That's the essential ingredient there from the male for conception to occur. And there are really three things that would be evaluated for the male partner as a result of like a semen analysis. And sperm is really just a tiny portion of semen. It's only about 3 or 5% of semen. So the semen gets collected, and maybe not so fun for the male partner. Might have to go into into the fertility office, and maybe it gets put in a room, and there might be some magazines or some porn videos to watch, and he's meant to masturbate and collect his semen there. And so I think that can be probably maybe humiliating and challenging for the male partner. And then the semen is analyzed to look at sperm count and to look at motility and morphology. And morphology is just the shape of the sperm. Do they look normal? And motility is sometimes dependent on morphology, but motility is the ability of the sperm to move, to navigate, because they've got a long journey to take.
Yeah, very, very helpful and insightful to give us a sense of what this looks like, especially biologically, and how this can occur in men and women. Now let's move to, I think, where all of us are really, our specialty is in the mental health realm. Where do we fit into this process?
And how does it impact couples?
I think that's the first place to start, is how does it impact first the individual and the couple? And even going back to the last question a little bit about the male partner contribution versus female partner contribution in infertility, and often there's an unknown quality to the infertility, like why is this couple not getting pregnant? And the specialists can't determine exactly why. Sometimes it'll be clearly like a sperm problem. Sometimes it will be clearly an egg or ovulation problem. But often it's an unknown problem or a multiple factor problem. But regardless of sort of where the problem lies, or whether there's even a ready way to identify the problem, it's going to be felt and manifested more likely in the female partner, within her, physically and emotionally, for a number of different reasons. And I'm not saying this is always true, and I'm certainly not dismissing the pain and sadness that male partners might experience as well. But even, for example, if the problem is a sperm problem, ultimately, through either medical interventions to help the male partner's sperm come along, or through using a sperm donor, ultimately this whole conception process needs to take place in the female partner's body, or at least the implantation process. Even if the conception occurs in a lab with IVF, the female partner is the one who is going to host this new organism, this future baby. And so what I see so often in my practice, and what I experienced in my own journey, is a real sense of a kind of roller coaster of hopefulness and despair. And remember, we've got like these typical, say, 28-day cycles, during which there's this opportunity at the beginning of the cycle, this opportunity that's building up, and the couple or the individual is eager and maybe even desperate to get pregnant. And there are all sorts of measures that are going into place to try to assure that, even if we're at the very early stages, where it's just like, let's try as much as we can the old-fashioned way. I'm checking my temperature. I've got, I know this is the ovulation time. Let's have lots of good sex. There's still, whether it's the old-fashioned like pregnancy through sex, or whether it's through these reproductive assisted technologies, there's still all of this buildup of hope. And then perhaps, if conception doesn't occur, this crushing despair, especially when couples have been at it for months or years.
Mhm.
So I think that's, to me, like one of the most powerful things to remember is that it's, it's such, I can't even think of a better word or metaphor than a roller coaster, because it really is such an up and down ride for people who are going through this. And the male partner, of course, is experiencing these same things, but on a more secondary level. And so the female partner not only can feel despair, but also guilt. Like, what's wrong with my body? Why didn't it take this time? What is it? Did I, not drink enough water? Did I forget my vitamins that day? Like all this potential sort of, I don't know, magical thinking about the ways in which I did not prepare my body successfully for this thing to occur within it.
And I think our culture somewhat perpetuates that too. So I'm not shy that my husband and I have had 2 miscarriages. And after our first, a big piece that was said was, I knew you shouldn't have been running, from family members, or, well, why did you tell everyone before 13 weeks? Now you've made everyone sad. And it really perpetuates the stigma that it's something the woman did wrong. And it's just so inaccurate and painful. Truly painful.
Exactly. Yeah. And just contributes to that sense of guilt. Oh, it's my responsibility. It's my failure. And even if people aren't saying that, I think we're so good at doing that to ourselves to begin with. Like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have coughed as hard as I coughed. Like, we have all these beliefs that it's some little, sort of quirk of our behavior that resulted in the pregnancy or in the failure of the pregnancy to occur, or the miscarriage of it.
When this is happening, when do you often see the individual, or do you advocate to bring in both partners? What does that look like clinically for you?
For me, it's always looked at either I'm working with an individual and this is part of what we're working on in her therapy, or I'm working with a couple and it's part of what we're working on in our couples therapy. I don't typically make the transition back and forth between individual and couples work. So it's typically one or the other.
Got it. And what is the process look like? What are we working on in the room when somebody's coming in and experiencing despair?
Right. Well, relationally, let's talk about how that affects couples, because it can cause so many different kinds of stress for couples. Financial stress. If people are really moving into the assisted reproductive technologies, I mean, like a single in vitro fertilization measure is upwards of $10,000. And for some people, insurance might cover some or all of it. But for many people, there is no insurance, or the insurance isn't going to cover it. And that's even separate from the medications, which can also be a couple $1,000s. So financial stress. The sexual relationship, I mean, let's talk about that, right? This couple, if we're talking about a heterosexual couple that's been trying to get pregnant, they've been trying to use the old-fashioned method. Like, this is what people think. It's what we assume. Like, okay, we have sex, we get pregnant. And it hasn't happened. And so maybe they've tried to increase the frequency of their sex. And maybe they've tried to time their sex for very specific, okay, this is the ideal day, we have to do it now. And maybe their sexual relationship has suffered because it's no longer just for pleasure, for intimacy, for connection. It's become now this sort of mechanism to get us pregnant, and it's resulted in some failure. So they're maybe not feeling so good about their sexual intimacy. It's just become mechanical as a means to an end, and their relationship has suffered as a result of that.
And that carries long past the trying to get pregnant, right? We see, and I'm sure you can attest this, couples then that even once they have conceived and have a baby, who feel disconnected sexually, or feel like sex is solely based on a mission rather than that enjoyment. And it has a profound ripple effect in the course of that relationship.
And traumatizing, because you're revisiting it, despair. It's like, here we go again to give ourselves hope, only to what?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a really good point, Kim, that how even after the couple, if they're able to conceive and have a baby, it's not like there's a complete reversal on this sexual challenge that they faced. And they might still have lingering, like you said, Greg, lingering trauma, lingering sense of sex as sort of this pro forma or mechanical thing. It's maybe lost its luster.
Yeah, and I can
And
imagine.
then if we think about,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, sort of moving on from the sexual piece. Were you going to say something else about the sexual piece, Greg?
Well, I was kind of adding to I feel that the partners get defensive and they often will maybe displace blame on each other. So ends up being conflict around it, which takes away from the desire to even want to have sex sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. That's a really good point. And the pain of, failing to conceive can just linger sort of in that space between. And that is what I was going to talk about too, is just the emotional, the kind of gendered differences in the infertility response. I think, and I don't know, whether there is good empirical literature for this, but certainly in, my own readings and anecdotal observations of couples, it tends to be, I think, much more challenging for the female partner for a number of different reasons. As I already said, like, she is the host of this thing that is, supposed to occur naturally and isn't for whatever reason. And there's all sorts of guilt and sadness and longing. But also there's a really different kind of pressure, a time pressure that women experience that men don't experience. So, if we think about a heterosexual couple, let's say they're in their early 30s, and she maybe is there, and maybe they both are like equally eager to plan for a family, to start, like, let's try to have sex and see whether we get pregnant. And after a year or a year and a half or 2 years, it's not happening. She's starting to be aware that I've got limited time. And she is feeling this pressure of, like, we've got to move forward. We've got to make this happen. And it's true, like, women's fertility, it has a window. And that window starts closing after age 30 slowly, but then faster and faster. And, once we get to 40, the odds of becoming pregnant are greatly diminished. And so there's an awareness that the female partner has that I have limited time, whereas he may feel none of that same pressure. I'm still building my career. We've got I love the travel that we can do together. Let's not hurry. Why? And this can cause conflict between the two of them, because his fertility, while it will diminish over time, it's much slower, and there's no finite window. There's no menopause for men.
Mm-hmm. And again, perpetuated by culture, right? For women who are 36 and older, we talk about it as advanced maternal age, or formally here was geriatric pregnancy, which makes me cringe. And we tell women this, like, we remind them of this time clock over and over and over again in our culture. It's rough.
Right.
So when you see couples going through this, what are some challenges that couples commonly express in terms of the emotional space between them?
Yeah, I think it's just that, maybe their sexual relationship has already taken a hit, and maybe they're not really on the same page in terms of their fertility journey. She typically wants to move more quickly, is more willing to, take the financial risk, is more, more, quite frankly, kind of desperate to make it happen. And if the partner is not able to kind of meet her where she is, that's going to cause all sorts of friction and pain, and and even in some relationships, a sense like, okay, for her, like, okay, if you're not on my journey with me, I've got to sign out now. And maybe it's even like, we need to separate, we need to divorce now, because I need to find a different partner who can fulfill this need for me.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple that there was a case where the female partner had moved on from a relationship like you're talking about, but they were so scared to try, even though the new male partner really wanted to have a child, but they were very scared to try because of all the trauma and the blame that they got from the male partner in the previous relationship. And so their decision to have a child actually shifted because of how traumatizing it was for them. And I don't know if you've experienced that or have noticed that even the decision to have a child changes because of how traumatizing this experience can be for individuals and couples.
Yeah, I haven't experienced that particular kind of scenario, but the trauma, I appreciate the use of that word, because I do think it is traumatic, and not in the gut punch, like sort of acute, devastating way, but in the more like insidious build up over time way, where it's just so such like repeated, again, that roller coaster of repeated disappointments. And as you said, Greg, some potential blame, like we knew this was the time I was ovulating. Why did you delay? How come you weren't there? And you didn't, the partners can blame one another for this not happening on the timeline that they wanted to happen.
For those who are listening that aren't the ones going through infertility, but are supporting those, have friends, family who are struggling with infertility, what kinds of tools or suggestions do you have for them to offer loving support?
Yeah, I think the first thing is really just some sensitivity that we all need around people's reproductive choices. And I think there's an assumption that probably is pretty natural for folks until you go through your own fertility crisis, that when you want to get pregnant, you make it happen. And this is part of the pain of infertility, is that like we've learned to have agency over our bodies, and this belief that like try harder and it'll work. And all the trying in the world doesn't necessarily get an individual or a couple pregnant. And so I think there are comments that family and friends make that can be really crushing to a couple that's trying to get pregnant. Some that are just sort of assuming that everything will go fine. Parents, grandparents, in-laws who say, when are you going to give us a grandbaby? And maybe the couple is in their own sort of depression because they haven't been able to make it happen. Mm-hmm. Or maybe a person says to her colleagues at work, like or he says, my wife and I are trying to get pregnant, and the response is, oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. Like you're having lots of good sex, lucky you. And not recognizing that trying to get pregnant can be an enormous source of pain for people. So I think that's the first thing on kind of a general level. I think from, a more therapeutic point of view, what we can do is have awareness of the processes that occur, both the emotional and relational processes within a couple, and particularly a heterosexual couple, where those responses can become very gendered. But also the actual interventions. And I don't think everybody needs to be an expert, but to have some knowledge. Like if you are working with a client who's experiencing infertility challenges, I think it's your job as a therapist to try to learn a little bit about what the procedures might entail, just in the rough way that we've talked about here today, just a little bit about what that person might be going through.
Yeah, and another thing too, when you talk about the insensitivities, I hear a lot of people say, just wait till you have kids. You don't know if that couple is able to have kids, and that one's tough. Right. When talking to, there's like this underlying expectation that everyone's just going to have kids, and that's just the next step, but that's not always the case. So I'm glad you brought the insensitivities up. Mm-hmm. I also want to talk on couple processes in couples therapy and what that looks like. I know from my standpoint, I get a lot of couples who come in and they just want to solve it right away. They want to solve things right away, talk about it, but there's really not an understanding or even tools to understand the process by which that's even allowed to, even in this case, grieve together, to support mm-hmm. one another. What is that experience for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I really like how you said grieve together and support one another. And I think often infertility isolates people from their support networks because it's a private thing. It's their sexual, it's relational, it's biological. And there are some people who will readily, easily share what they're working on in terms of their quest to become pregnant. But there are a lot of people who don't share it with anybody. And kind of like what you were saying before, Kim, about like, oh, you're not supposed to, there's all these superstitions that you shouldn't tell people. And so often they are pretty isolated emotionally in this journey that they're taking. And they do need to learn to empathize with one another and to grieve together, even if it's like intermittent grief and hope, right? And how can they share that with one another? And I think the therapist's job is really to help them communicate across often as these kind of gendered ways of thinking and being in the world, communicate and understand one another better by holding space, by slowing it down, by moving away from, okay, what's the next solution? Okay, well, that didn't work this month. Let's try, and yes, their solutions are important, but listening to one another is every bit as important.
To make it feel safe again, that if we were to go through this again, I have you. And I see differences too in partners' processing of stress. And I think about it as one partner being maybe internal and needing space, and that can often leave the other partner isolated. And just little minute things of how even the stress is processed on an individual level and how that moves into the couple system, and helping them learn what that is and what each other needs, and to reach out and to help depersonalize it maybe for some, or the person who needs to talk about it and the other one's avoiding because it's too traumatic.
Right. Yeah, and then sometimes, one person will come to a certain decision and the partner is in a very different place. Like maybe after, let's say, this, a couple has gone through 2 or 3 IUIs, intrauterine inseminations, at some significant expense, and the clinicians are saying, okay, that wasn't successful. And by clinicians, I mean the reproductive technological people are saying, well, really the next step for you as a couple is in vitro fertilization, IVF. And maybe one partner is at the point of saying, like, we can't do that. It's been too much on my body, or we don't have the finances, or it's too painful. I'm just ready to move on. And the other one is saying, no, we've got to continue to try. And so as a therapist, how do we help bridge that really important difference? It has such like material impact on them and on their future. Are they going to, become a family with a child that they've birthed somehow, or are they going to move forward in a different direction? Oh, and one other thing about insensitivities too is, like, I think often people will say, well, you could just adopt.
Oh.
And adoption can be a great opportunity for people who choose that, but not everybody wants it. Not everybody is willing to go in that direction.
So painful.
So, yeah. And I think about, and I'm so grateful that you're here sharing this. This has been a lot of important and very insightful information. Do you have any tips, I guess, for anyone listening that might be worried about it or might be experiencing that or going through this right now?
Yeah, I guess tips I have are around for people who are going through it to get social support. And I don't necessarily mean like air your very personal pain with your colleagues or friends or even family members if that doesn't feel comfortable for you. But there are some great online forums. There are some, we're in an age where you can find a support group for just about everything and anything through online resources. So, and also there are, at most clinics that do reproductive technologies, there are support groups there. So even if you're not comfortable talking with your partner, your mother, your sister about what you're going through, maybe you can find a support group that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And then I think even seeking out a therapist who might be able to process the trauma more specifically, or that grieving
and who is trained in this space, right? And so they have that background knowledge of what you're going through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We very much appreciate all of your insights today and are just grateful for your wealth of knowledge that has been shared. Randi, as we're exiting, any last tidbits that you would like to share with our listeners?
I guess the only thing is that, we've talked so much about heterosexual couples, and I do think that it's important to acknowledge the single individuals. I'm seeing more and more women who are maybe in their early 30s, let's say, and haven't yet found the partner that they're looking for to start a family with, who are deciding, I'm going to go through this process of freezing my eggs to kind of hedge my bets or create more opportunity for myself, given that I don't know what my future holds. And even that, I think, it's a financially costly decision and a painful one emotionally, to acknowledge, like, well, I don't know that my path to family is going to look like I expected it to look when I was 20.
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking outside the box in terms of individual people, and in terms, again, of the same-sex couples whose journey to starting a family is never going to be the one that is like, okay, have sex and make a baby and you're on. And so we need to be really sensitive to how they, like, that they'll face different challenges, which are often include stigma from family, from medical providers, from people who assume that gay and lesbian partners are not going to be somehow the same sort of rock star parents that heterosexual partners are, and which is a really preposterous sort of assumption.
I appreciate that insight, and we are just so grateful for your time today. This has been Relationships Inside Out, where today we talked about infertility with Dr. Randi Smith. If anyone has any questions for her or future topic suggestions, please feel free to email us at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com. Thank you so much, Dr. Randi.
Thanks. It's been my pleasure.